This is tape recordings being made February 3rd, 1969, in the home of Frank Herbert in Fairfax, California. Frank and his wife, Bev, are sitting around. Myself.
In February 1969, just 4 years after the release of Dune, Frank Herbert and his wife, Beverly Stewart, sat down with their friend Willis McNelly in their home. This wasn't a formal interview for a newspaper or a press event to promote Frank's books. It was just some friends geeking out about a story they were all passionate about.
Frank and his wife, Bev, are sitting around. Myself, Dr. Willis E. McNelly of Cal State English Department in Fullerton, California, sitting around talking about science fiction. And
McNelly recorded the almost 90-minute-long conversation, which covered everything from Frank's inspiration for Dune to heady discussions about morality and ethics. It was a podcast before there were podcasts.
If I'd known, I would have brought in a mess of beers. By the way, we have another wine in there.
No, I'm going to stick to coffee for a while, thanks. I'll be up all night reading, but then what difference does it make?
It's clear from the tape how much of a fan McNelly is, even interrupting the recording at one point to compare his notes on sandworm life cycles with Frank.
The final, let's say, complete life cycle of Shia.
Yeah, do you want me to pin it down for you? I can. I mean, I had it in mind.
You had it in mind?
Yeah, but
I had it worked out too. Let's compare notes.
Well, I'd be interested, before I say anything, to hear what you have to say.
I got to get my book. I'm going to turn this off for a minute.
But there's a moment near the end of the recording when Frank tells a throwaway story that caught our attention. Frank and McNelly are talking about the tarot cards in Dune Messiah, and then Frank says this.
I terrified a gal one time when I was about 17. And we were sitting across from each other on hassocks. The mouth of the fireplace, a big stone fireplace between us, down to embers. And we didn't have anything going. She was just a gal I knew. I happened to have had a crush on her younger sister, and she knew it. And unrequited love at 17 is a hideous thing, you know.
Oh, yes.
We've all been there, Frank. He continues, explaining how predictions and tarot were popular at the time. So this friend grabs a deck of cards and begins shuffling them.
And she said, see if you can predict the cards. She'd been shuffling them, you see. So she picked up the first card. And I closed my eyes and I saw that card. So I told her that was it. She put it down. That was the card.
Okay, sure. Beginner's luck. But then he keeps predicting.
I swear to you, Will, I went through that entire deck, predicting every card that she was going to see, and there wasn't a failure at all. I told her every card, and I did it the same way every time.
And then, against all odds, he does it again.
I don't know what it was, but I predicted what the cards were. And I said, my goodness, this is fascinating. Let's do it again. Shuffle them again. So she shuffled the deck again and cut them a few times, and we started going through them again.
But then it gets too weird for Frank's friend. She freaks out.
We got down 5 or 6 cards into the deck, and suddenly she threw the whole deck down in the heart of the fireplace and said, this scares me. I don't want to do this anymore.
McNelly, sounding a bit confused, asks Frank for clarification.
Have you ever had that kind of success?
Never again.
So why did this catch our ears? This story doesn't illustrate much about Dune, it doesn't reveal any lore tidbits, and it took place decades before Frank wrote the book. But what it does reveal is a glimpse into the mind of Frank Herbert. We know he's an incredibly curious person. We also know that he wrote an iconic sci-fi series steeped in politics and philosophy.
And yet here he is, sharing a story about something weird and unexplainable happening to him. It's fascinating to think of Frank not only as a deeply rational and intelligent person who wrote fantastic stories, but as someone who maybe believed in a universe beyond our understanding. Someone who thought a deck of cards could be more than a game. For
today's episode, we examined hours of records like this McNelly tape to try and understand the story of Dune through the mind of its creator. We found a lot that's already common knowledge, like Frank's environmentalist beliefs or his skepticism of government. But we also discovered ideas that changed our perspectives on Dune.
We do a lot of fun speculating and interpretation on this show about Frank's iconic universe. But today, we're doing something different. We're hearing from the man himself, in his own words, what Dune is about. Welcome to Interviews with Frank Herbert. Welcome to Gom Jabbar, your guide to the iconic world of Dune. We'll be exploring the themes, philosophies, and characters found in the sandy depths of this vast universe, from Frank Herbert's groundbreaking novels to the adaptations on film and TV. My name is Leo.
And my name's Abu.
And today on the show, today's episode, very interesting, new, strange, bizarre, but not bad, hopefully.
Hopefully. That's the plan. Today's episode is going to be this hopefully interesting meta-analysis of Dune, the story, through the lens of all of this research that we've been doing for the past couple of weeks. We've been digging into public and private interviews with Frank Herbert, many of which were published, others that never actually made it to the page or to the screen, to try and get a sense of what Dune is about through the man's own words. We talk all the time on this podcast about wanting to ask Frank what he meant by this line or this paragraph, or why this story arc took place at this time, or why the pacing was this way or that way.
Right, yeah.
So we set out down a rabbit hole that we didn't expect to fall to try and answer those very questions through the words of the creator of Dune himself.
Yeah. You'll hear from us and also Frank today.
That's right.
Well, today's episode will contain spoilers up through God Emperor of Dune. So, as long as you are up to date on our book club episodes, you're good to go, listener.
And a huge shout out at the top of the show, as always, to our Kwisatz Haderach level patrons, Case Aiken, Daniel Dion, Roman Caballo, Jonathan Lambert, and C.R. Spruill.
Yeah.
Folks.
Yeah.
No weird thank you today, just a genuine thank you. It's because of your support that we get to take 2 weeks. We get to skip a week of episodes to do the truly incredible amount of research we had to for an episode like this.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be able to do it without you. So thank you to our Kwisatz Haderach level patrons for their support. But of course, that thank you extends to all of our patrons at every level who truly make this show possible, and in particular, make episodes like this possible.
Indeed. We could not do it without you. So, here is the game plan for today's episode. We, as Abu has said, dug through hours and hours and pages of interviews with Frank Herbert. So, we are going to be honing in on kind of 3 big insights that we've taken away from this research.
Yes.
First, we're going to talk about the origins of Dune.
Correct.
What inspired him to write the story? How did the story come into existence? That sort of thing.
Yep.
Then we'll dig into Frank as an environmentalist, examining some of his, at times, fiery takes on renewable energy and economic dependencies. He had strong opinions.
Very.
And finally, we'll look at his anti-establishment and anti-Messiah messages. Hey, did you know that Dune had anti-Messiah messages?
What? My white savior story?
Yeah. Paul, the hero, Paul. Yeah. He's, turns out, maybe you should be cautious to follow him.
And you don't have to take our word for it. You're going to hear from Frank himself about that.
It's true. These are keystones in what makes Dune, Dune. And that's how the episode's going to play out.
So, before we jump into it, let's take a breather. Let's compose ourselves. Let's get ready to hear from the legend himself, Frank Herbert, right after this break. We'll see you in a minute, folks.
Welcome back, everybody. We hope your Ouija board is primed. We hope the candles are lit. We hope the seance is ready to begin. Let's get into it. Let's hear from Frank. And let's begin by looking at Frank's curiosity. the curiosity
Yeah.
that made Frank Frank, and how it led to Dune.
That's right. I mean, it's one of the first things that stood out to me as we were digging into this research and listening to interviews and reading through transcripts. Frank was just this boundlessly curious man,
Yeah.
almost to an obsessive degree. For example, he says in this 1977 PBS interview that this curiosity is actually what helped him write such a dense sci-fi story like Dune, full of politics and economics and philosophy and religion, all of these things that he's no expert on, but he was able to do the research on.
I'm curious, extremely curious, and I became an investigative reporter very early on. An investigative reporter who didn't just react. I wanted to know, I wanted to dig. I would follow a line of endeavor, a line of reading, a line of interest, until I felt I had exhausted it.
This is hardly surprising to hear from Frank, right?
Yeah.
I could understand if he was like a comparative religion doctorate. He would write a book where there's all these religions being compared. Sweet, sure. But when we have, you know, the Arabic and Islamic history, when we have the Zen Buddhism and the Japanese No theater that starts emerging in God Emperor of Dune, there are so many disparate examples. To hear that this is a byproduct of just his desire to dig and his sort of like rabbit hole research method of just reading and reading and reading and following it to the point of feeling like, okay, I've read all there is to read about Japanese No theater. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That tracks.
I feel somewhat of a kinship with Frank knowing that, you know, learning this about him. I love a good rabbit hole. I, too, find myself obsessively, you know, the other day I was like, maybe I'll get into X-Men. So I downloaded so many X-Men comics.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm going to binge X-Men 96. You know, I made all these plans for things I don't actually have time for.
Sure, yeah.
But I certainly feel that urge that Frank definitely felt throughout his life to dig and dig and dig until he felt like he got to the bottom of the thing he was curious about.
Yeah. Well, I'll end up on like Wikipedia pages explaining like abstract particle physics things. And I'm like, cool. I'm never going to use this. Like, this is not useful, right. But
exactly.
Sure is interesting.
Frank did that and then turned it into a best-selling sci-fi novel. You know, he did use it.
It's true. And this curiosity, this piece of his personality that he brings up time and time again, is ultimately what led him down the rabbit hole that led to Dune, right?
Yeah.
This led him to Oregon to write a magazine article called They Stopped the Moving Sands, I believe was the title. And this was going to be a magazine article that ended up not even being published. So this was just Frank collecting mountains of research as he's obsessively begins learning about, okay, sand dunes, the difficulty of deserts, how deserts interact with desert societies and how they impact the human element. And this is where the seed is planted of the idea for this story that takes place on an all-desert planet. And here is a clip. This is, again, from the sit-down conversation Frank had with McNally, by the way, compiler of the Dune Encyclopedia, in case you've forgotten the name.
Yeah,
this
very
is
same
the
McNally.
same. Yeah, this is the same McNally. So, again, when people challenge us on why is the Dune Encyclopedia canon, the dude was fucking hanging out with Frank in his living room. Like, come on.
McNally had his own notes on sandworm life cycles after just reading the first fucking book.
Yeah, that he's like, hey, Frank, can we compare notes? And Frank's like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, Frank's like, I mean, I fucking came up with it. Sure, we can compare notes, but mine are going to be better.
Mine are better.
Yeah, same exact McNally. But Frank does tell McNally in this 1969 recording about all of this data that he ended up with for this magazine article that, as you said, never even got published.
Right. Here's that clip.
And the whole idea fascinated me, so I started researching sand dunes. And, of course, from sand dunes, it's a logical idea to go into a desert. And the way I accumulate data is I start building file folders. And before long, I saw that I had far too much for an article and far too much for a story, for a short story. I didn't know really what I had, but I had an enormous amount of data. And avenues shooting off at all angles to gather more, and I was following them.
It's fun to hear that.
Fun to hear.
I mean, it's clear that Frank loved doing this kind of deep research. And to, again, reinforce this idea, there's yet again another clip we want to share with you. Years later, in a 1985 speech that he gave at UCLA, he talks again about how much he loves doing research.
Okay, I was going to do this book, and I started researching a lot of things. The research is, oh boy, that's the fun part. Anthropology, comparative religions, geology. I spent 6 years preparing.
It's so interesting to me to compare what people think a job is, which is to say, like, oh yeah, Frank's a novelist. So I'm sure he sits down and he does the work of being a novelist, which is writing novels.
Clack,
yeah.
Clack,
you know, yeah. Just typewriting chapter 3, the man walked, and that's it. That is. But what the job actually is, at least for someone like Frank Herbert, is the research. It's the meeting people, knocking on doors, asking them to share with them your expertise. And he happened to love doing that, right? This is an alignment of what the job actually became for him and what he loved to do, which then, of course, leads to a universe that personally I think is really vibrant and full of fun little details that are clearly byproducts of these research rabbit holes that Frank went down. So very, very cool to hear that. Well, just again, that he's doing all this research and not just grabbing the nearest encyclopedia, flipping to a random page and being like, well, I guess this.
Right. And it leads credence to a lot of our theories over the years and over the episodes, trying to connect small details in the books to real historical events or real historical inspirations. That's not us just being crazy and looking things up and digging too deep. So, sometimes it is us being like putting our tinfoil hats on, to be fair.
We're not crazy. You're crazy.
You're crazy. But to me, this is very reassuring to hear how much research Frank does and how much he loves doing it, because it leads credence to our own theories. When we do a ton of research for an episode and dig into a Japanese no theater hole, we might be following the trail that Frank Herbert once did 30, 40, 50 years ago as he was researching that story.
It's really cool.
So it's very reassuring to me personally to hear Frank say this.
Totally. Yeah.
Now, moving on from his curiosity, we learn a couple of really interesting details about the publication of the first novel. As we've discussed on this podcast before, Dune was originally serialized in John Campbell Jr.'s Analog magazine, this science fiction magazine, in parts, and then it was eventually collected together into a single novel and published in 1965. And in a 1973 interview with the Vertex magazine, Frank actually explained how his original idea for Dune was massive. He actually ended up breaking up that original idea into what would then become the first 3 books as we know them today: Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune. Specifically from that interview, Frank said this, quote, "It was much longer. I cut it up into 3 parts and held out more than a third of it for the first book. Even before I knew that Dune was so successful, I wrote Dune Messiah, which was planned as a pivotal book pointing both backward and forward because I had a long-range concept of the treatment of this messianic impulse in human society." End quote.
Interesting.
That to me is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Specifically, this quote from the Vertex magazine responds to this conversation in the Dune fandom that was happening online, where folks online were like, I read Dune, I loved the movie. Should I wait for Denis Villeneuve's Messiah, or should I just read Messiah now? Or should I even read Messiah at all? Is it that important?
Yeah.
And you and I, of course, have always had the stance that like Messiah is incredibly important to understanding Frank's original message and in not misunderstanding it as a hero's journey, realizing it's actually a warning against messiahs. And Frank himself here is practically saying that. He's saying, I already had the idea for Dune and Dune Messiah and the larger arc of this messianic figure. And Dune Messiah was a pivotal book in that story. What was important to him telling the larger story that he was trying to tell and in understanding his message. So that to me puts to rest any questions of did Frank Herbert actually say Messiah was important? Or was it just a sequel he wrote to a book that got popular?
Yeah, I also think it can be a little column A, column B, where you see the way that your story's landing and the questions people are asking and what they're taking away from a book, and then adjust course a little bit so that the thesis of the first book is even more clear with the subsequent novel, and that it's not, as you're saying, some people might see it as just, oh, let me ride the coattails of my newfound success. It's, no, I'm continuing the same point that I was making in the first book, that I intended to in the first place.
Yeah, maybe he didn't initially plan on leaning so hard into Space Hitler, but then he was like, wait a second, people are reading Dune and really cheering for this Paul guy. I got to go hard the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting quote, and it's fascinating to hear it from Frank himself, that he had a pretty large overall plan for the Dune story he wanted to tell, figured out, from the very beginning. And it sounds like it was pretty much because of publishing industry reasons and needing to make money and getting his book published, and editors like John Campbell Jr. having feedback, that the book got sort of cut up. It sounded like he wanted to release a giant tome. And
yeah.
John Campbell Jr. was like, I can't sell a tome, but I can sell a trilogy. So you want to do that.
Yeah, 100%. He's like, how do you feel about a 3,000-page book? Everyone's like, no. He's like, fuck, damn it. I'm tired of magazines.
Right.
Well, two final bits of information on the publication of Dune before we talk about some of these themes that we teased at the beginning of the episode. And these details both come from an interview with Charles Platt, who wrote a 1980 book, Dream Makers, The Uncommon People Who Write Science Fiction. And disclosure, Charles Platt's a fucking nerd. Can't wake up early. Eats breakfast late. Didn't read Dune before talking to... you and I were raging about this guy. Pretty good interview, and he wrote down what Frank said in his own words and exact quotes. So still a reliable source, but man, he did not do any prep work before meeting with Frank Herbert, the legendary author of Dune. Yeah, it wild to me. Like, you're going to show up and just not do the basic thing, whatever. Yeah. Nevertheless, from this book, we get some good information, and
we do.
Frank is talking to him and tells Platt that Dune was rejected by 22 publishers, 11 of them major publishing houses, before its eventual release by the Chilton Book Company, known mainly for its auto repair manuals.
Yes.
Now, Frank recounts a story to Platt where he went to New York City, right? The holy land for book publishing, and met with the publishing house and walked away from that meeting with the distinct feeling of, these guys have no fucking clue what they're doing.
Yeah. That's wild. I mean, Frank loves to describe himself in many of these interviews as sort of like this country bumpkin, and he was like, I went to the big city, to New York City. I was meeting with this big publishing house, and they were going to help me sell my book, and it was going to be great, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, he describes to Platt that he just had this meeting with these executives at this publishing house and was like, these fuckers have no clue what they're doing.
Yeah.
There's another anecdote in here that's really interesting. After he recounts this story of going to New York and being disappointed, Frank also talks about, kind of in a joking manner, with Platt, how many critics, when Dune first came out, many critics hated it.
Yeah.
He says specifically to Platt, quote, they really do not control the market. The market goes on without them, and Dune is a perfect example of the truth of that. Do you know that Dune was panned by every critic? End quote.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because I think if you were to ask the big wigs at the biggest publishing companies, they'd be like, oh no, what we say matters significantly. But what we see with big media executives to this day is they think they know what's going to be a box office success or whatever, and then there's a disconnect. And people go, we don't want this. We don't. The Minecraft movie is a great example of that. Like, the trailer just dropped and people are kind of, shitting on it. And, whatever your opinions on it, I know that some corporate executives sat around and went, oh, they're gonna love this. Who do we have? Jack Black's. Oh, Jack Black's is the best. Jason Momoa's, love that guy. Put Jason Momoa's in it. And it's like,
wasn't he the main character in that movie about the worms?
He was the main character in the movie with the worms. They like accidentally get it right. People are like, yeah, kind of. Good point. Yeah, so that feels very resonant, and I'm glad to hear Frank kind of got to the truth of it, because for sure, if you have authors allowing the executives at publishing companies to dictate what kinds of books they write, the types of books we'd be getting would be so boring, because it would all just be like pandering to market demand, which is not a good way to create art.
Yeah, definitely. And look, if you thought if we weren't going to fucking go find one of these reviews from 1965 that Frank is talking about, you're wrong. We did.
Yeah.
So here we go. Here's a review from 1965 written by Bill Rabe for the Detroit Free Press. This is Bill's review, or at least a part of his review, of Dune. Quote, stripped of all its mystic, confusion, and vocabulary, this is sort of a third-rate Civil War novel. We are constantly faced with events we have been assured earlier in the book are impossible. Finally, we are led to believe the death of the hero is inevitable, the hero having pre-seen aspects of it after that poison bit with the worm, only to find him on his feet, hale, hearty, mean, and a lovable religious nut at the end of the last chapter. Alas, science fiction just isn't worth the jammed zap gun without a good story. End quote.
What a magnificently bad take. What like a tremendously incredible, awful take. Bill Rabe.
It sounds like Bill Rabe didn't understand the story.
It sounds like Bill Rabe. What do you mean? A jammed zap gun? Where did you get that?
Right.
So weird.
Kind of revealing that that's what Bill Rabe thinks sci-fi is. You know, he had to throw a little sci-fi pun into his last line there in the review.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering, like, this was also what John Campbell Jr. wanted to do to sci-fi, because sci-fi in the, like, 40s and 50s was all very camp and very, like, pop and very, you know, it's all Zap Brannigan, heroes and interesting costumes saving damsels, you know? It's like that sort of classic archetype. So then having something that is, he's like, aside from the mystic confusion, I'm like, I think the mystic confusion is the whole reason it's great.
That's the whole point, Bill.
That's the whole point.
Bill, look at me.
Bill,
look at me.
Bill, eye contact, Bill. Come on, over here. Bill.
Put the fidget spinner away, Bill. Pay attention.
He's got like a coal-powered fidget spinner from the 1920s. Yeah, see? Mystic confusion. I'm confused.
Yeah,
stripped of its...
I loved that. I was so glad that review is still around. It's actually tough. I tried to look for others as well, but it's really tough to find old archives from 65. But good on the Detroit Free Press for still having this up on their site.
Yeah.
One quick note I wanted to make here. Based on these anecdotes, again, this is a book that was published in 1980. So Frank is quite successful at this point in his career. He's gone through Dune and a couple of sequel books already. What I find interesting is when you compare this interview with Chris Platt and the way that Frank speaks here with the tape of McNelly all the way back in 1969, after just the first book had come out. It's fascinating to see Frank's self-confidence and, you know, I would maybe wager to classify it as a little bit of arrogance grow over the years as well. And for me, at least, that really helps me square the fact that books like Heretics and Chapter House, and even a little bit of God Emperor of Dune, feel to me like more unrestrained Frank. Feel like Frank without the shackles on. Feel like Frank saying, like, I don't care what the editor says, I'm going to put this idea in here. And it's fun to see in these interviews, as we go through the years and the decades of Frank growing as a successful author and storyteller, watching the way he speaks in interviews evolve as well. His confidence evolving. Instead of saying things like, my contention is, which is a way he says it responds to a lot of McNelly's questions. You know, I think, my contention is, I believe. In these later interviews, he's making like very assertive statements. This is the way it is. this is big oil fucking us over. You know, his confidence is definitely evolving in himself and in his ideas. And it's fun to see that evolve in these interviews, but then also a little bit bleed its way into the latter books as well, as he grows as an author in fame and self-confidence.
Yeah, it is very cool. I think part of that is he's just experiencing more of the industry, so he can speak more kind of from the chest about that.
Yeah.
He's meeting more people, he's reading more books, he's growing in confidence. But also, there's got to be some part of it where he sees that the people in charge don't know what they're talking about. And then he goes, okay, so I can just be assertive because there's no one above me who knows better than me. So here's what I think.
It's fascinating. It's a bit of subtext that I was really picking up on during the research.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap up this section with, honestly, an incredible response that Frank has from Platt, who asks, what kind of feedback are you getting from readers?
Yep.
And Frank gives this genuinely incredible response.
Yep.
Quote, "The feedback has been very rewarding. Because of the kind of questions I get, I've been able to direct attention straight at what I was doing, and there's no equivocation about it. People say, for example, 'Were you forming a cult?' And I say, 'For the love of God, no. Quite the opposite. Don't follow me. What insanity. Really, I have an initial GPMFF. God preserve me from fanatics." End quote.
GPMFF!
Oh my God. He made an acronym. He made an acronym to help with the branding of his thesis for Dune. Be careful of messiahs. Oh my God. Good.
I mean, this is from Frank's own words, right? He's literally saying, this is what I was doing. This is the message of my story. I'm not forming a cult. Don't follow me. Don't worship me. Don't worship cult leaders. God save me from fanatics. Like, this is so clear.
Yeah.
And honestly, frankly, undeniable. He couldn't be clearer about what his message is in the books. And, I just wish the folks in the back of the class who weren't paying attention and who have made claims that Dune is a white savior story and a hero's journey would fucking listen to Frank.
He gave you an
listen
acronym.
To Frank Herbert himself. There's an acronym, folks. GPMFF.
GPMFF. Go on.
Incredible.
That would be good merch. GPMFF.
Yep. We got to start brainstorming. Yeah, it's cool. And again, I want to be clear. This isn't like revelation stuff, right? We have talked about these ideas for hours and hours and hours on this show. But what I think is exciting about digging into these interviews is that it reinforces the many things that many readers over decades have picked up on in the books. Frank is right here saying, this is what I was trying to do. This was my message. This is my warning. And so to get that confirmation from the man himself is fun, for me at least. It's exciting, it's reassuring, it makes it clear that Frank had a mission with Dune. And we are really picking up on what Frank put down in many of our conversations.
We are. We're not fully off base.
Exactly.
He's like, people ask me if I was starting a cult, and I said, yes, I am. Welcome to the cult. And then I put some sheep's blood across their forehead, and they became one of my Herbertarians.
That's right.
No, it is affirming to hear this from the man himself, for sure.
Totally.
Okay, we're going to continue and look at the ecology and Western fallacy of man in a second, but first we're going to take a quick break. So don't go anywhere. When we're back, we're hearing more from Frank Herbert himself.
Welcome back, folks. Now that we've covered the origins of Dune and the publication of Dune and some of the ideas that Frank was sprinkling in throughout, let's dig a bit deeper into those ideas, starting with Frank's environmentalism, the themes of ecology that are sprinkled all throughout this story. This is pretty common knowledge, right? Most people who read Dune, and particularly listeners of this podcast, understand that there are deep ecological themes sprinkled all throughout the story, throughout the entire saga. What's interesting, though, is just how often this came up in our research. Frank practically brings this up in like every interview about Dune.
Hey, Frank, how's it going? So ecology.
So
we
anyway,
need to protect the environment. It's like, okay.
Yeah. And honestly, that energy is not that off base, Leo, because it's clear from the interviews, especially when you listen to the taped interviews and the video interviews for TV. He's very passionate about his environmentalist beliefs. For example, if we zoom back to that 1969 McNally tape, this is what he had to say to McNally.
For example, I'm really hipped on this ecology thing. The consequences of some of the things that we're doing to our planet. There are ways of living with our planet, not against it. And this is the attitude that we have to develop. And it is an attitude.
Thank you, Mr. Keynes. Pardon, Keynes.
And what's also clear as we continue our research is that Frank's beliefs only grew with time. You know, he only became a much more ardent environmentalist.
He didn't back off, no.
He didn't back off. Again, if we fast forward to that PBS interview from 1977, 8 years after that McNally tape, this is what Frank said about his views.
I'm a believer in the high energy life. I just say we have to shift from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. And we have to start taking the steps now. We really do have to start taking those steps now. I do not want to be put in the position, I refuse to be put in the position of having to tell my grandchildren, and I have grandchildren, I'm sorry, there's no more world for you. We used it all up.
Man, that is crazy to hear, Leo. This is a man speaking in 1977 about how time is running out for our planet. And here we're fucking sitting in 2024, practically having the same conversations.
It's so discouraging. I mean, I feel
kind of, yeah.
I feel the same thing, honestly, going back and watching like Richard Pryor, like stand-up comedy, where he's just like, you know, you have these brilliant people speaking out very publicly about like societal issues that just have not gotten better in the last 50 years, 60 years.
Yep.
And to have someone like Frank, a renowned author, saying, I don't want to say to my grandchildren, we've used up the planet, I'm sorry. And then to look at where things are going. I mean, I know Frank would be super disappointed in how little progress has been made.
Yeah.
And it certainly is not helped by the fact that like every couple of steps forward is just so battled by lobbying and by big billion-dollar companies that have all of their investments in like fracking and shit. It's like, anyway, it is.
Yeah. It's frustrating stuff.
And it only makes sense that an author who works like Frank does, where he accumulates all of these thoughts and opinions and then uses those as the foundation upon which he writes his stories, it makes sense that humanity and humanity's relationship to nature makes its way into Dune.
Yep.
And in particular, Frank and Beverly, I loved this. I thought this was so incredible.
This was such a cool moment.
Such a great moment. And also actually gave me pause in Villeneuve's adaptation, because I think Villeneuve weakened this piece of what is clearly super pivotal. Mm-hmm. But we'll talk about that in a second. Frank and Beverly are talking to McNally, right, in their living room, and they tell him that Dr. Liet Kynes is the representation of Western man and his fumbling relationship with nature in this moment. So here's the quote. This is from about 8 minutes, and then you'll hear a little bit more from about 13 minutes into the interview.
Yeah, you realize that. We tend to think that we can overcome nature by a mathematical means. We accumulate enough data, and we just
examine
subdue
the
it.
parameters of that data and subdue it.
Yeah, we subdue nature. You see, Western man has assumed that if you have, that all you need for any problem is enough force, power, and that there is no problem which won't submit to this approach. Even the problem of our own ignorance. Which, you see, throws it out the window right there. Because it's an asinine assumption. And it is the basic fallacy of Western man's approach to living. Now, I'm not saying that we immediately drop this and adopt Vedanta.
Although that might not be a bad idea.
No, we need what I would call a science of wisdom. I think
So
Wow.
Kynes' death, as Frank explains in this conversation, is Frank's metaphor for the failure of Western thinking, that we subdue nature, that we control it through understanding it.
Wow.
The person who best understood Arrakis still died to Arrakis, was killed by the planet. And as Beverly says in that interview, more than anyone else, it's more tragic because Kynes knew better than anyone how he was being killed by nature.
Yeah.
So this idea that Kynes was a stand-in for Western modes of thinking and then dies to nature because of his failure to understand the truth, which is that we do not subdue nature. We are still beholden to it, and that we are part of the same system.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so poignant. It also very much reeks of the things that like Alan Watts talks about, where we tend to, in Western society, think about going out into nature, or going out into space, where we are already in space. We are already in nature.
Yep.
Nature is within us. It's one system. And this idea that it's separate systems is recent and is Western. And when you go to indigenous peoples around the world, it's not a mystery to them. They're like, yeah, we don't own the land. We're taking care of it because it takes care of us. And it's this symbiotic, we're part of,
Yeah.
it's so good.
And Frank makes that very clear in the McNally tape, right? He kind of brings it up over and over. He's like, I'm talking about Western ideology and Western man, quote unquote, right?
Yeah, in case I stuttered.
He keeps repeating to McNally that he's not trying to make some bold claim about humanity at large. And in fact, other cultures that he has researched in writing Dune have revealed to him that there's other ways to live with nature.
Yeah.
And other ways to treat our planet that are better than the way the West and Western ideologies treat nature, as you're saying. We're going into nature rather than we are nature. This philosophical difference in how we view our planet and the ecology that we are a part of. And Frank is very much, as he says, hip on that idea. He's very much talking about Western views, and he's criticizing those. He's not making any sort of claims about other cultures. And it's interesting that in the tape, he kept bringing that up. He wanted to be very clear about that.
There's multiple points where he's like, wait, just to be clear, we're still talking about Western man.
Yeah.
And McNally's like, yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's clear.
I mean, I'm definitely, whenever my next reread of Dune will be, it'll be so fascinating to view Kynes through this lens now that we know this, as a representation of Western man and Western ideals in their relationship with nature.
Yeah, and I think also this is where I might have a bit of new criticism for the Villeneuve adaptation, where Kynes...
I can sense where you're going here.
They leaned into Kynes as a representation of the Fremen and the Fremen's, sort of integrity and their, I don't know, maybe their view of off-worlders. And even though Duke Leto is a very respectable man, blah, 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 and then Kynes dying to Sardaukar and bringing Shai-Hulud and being eaten by Shai-Hulud, sure. Yeah, that's kind of in line, dying to Shai-Hulud, dying to this piece of Arrakis, and Shai-Hulud certainly is part of nature. Mm-hmm. It's still, we have reduced to the amount that Kynes is the human attempting to, through just data and knowledge, subjugate nature. Yeah. Because now Kynes is sort of like of the Fremen. I don't know. That seems like it's been weakened a little bit. And knowing now how central Kynes was and how important Kynes' role was as this piece of the ecological puzzle, I'm like, oh, maybe then, although I don't think the Dune adaptations are any worse, I do think they are less faithful than to the original source material. Mm-hmm. If Kynes was supposed to be this stand-in for this ecological message, by taking that away or changing it a little bit, maybe you've made it less faithful of an adaptation.
Yeah.
I don't know. Just a thought.
Or at least a shift in focus. I mean, I think throughout the movies, ecology takes a backseat to the more philosophical ideas about prescience and predestination and fate and messiahs and power and politics. I think ecology in both Dune Part 1 and Part 2 is a little bit hand-waved away, for sure, as a central theme, which is disappointing given our research here and learning how much ecology was important to Frank, and in particular important to him telling this story. It's like a core pillar of why he even wrote this story in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, moving on from that, there are obviously other major themes in the Dune saga, right? It's not just a book about trees and plants and ecology and deserts.
Right.
Frank was a deep thinker, as we know. He had a lot of ideas about humanity, politics, religion, all of which makes their way into his stories in some way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. And, of course, this is Frank we're talking about, so all of these ideas get pretty heady and philosophical and kind of quirky very quickly,
Yeah.
given the type of thinker he was. One example of that is, again, in that McNally tape, before the release of Dune Messiah, we see Frank toying with ideas that make an appearance in God Emperor of Dune. I found that so interesting.
You know, I think it's the idea that we can invent. Of course, science fiction is based on this. That we can invent anything we imagine, and having invented it, we must use it.
And then live by the consequences of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, this is the Western fallacy.
Very cool to hear that.
So
and again,
cool.
him sort of honing in on the idea of like, this is a particularly Western problem. He actually goes on to explain to McNally that this kind of thinking, for example, is why the Bene Gesserit fumbled the ball with their Kwisatz Haderach program. They had a certain intention with it, and then it backfired.
If you develop a psychological weapon sufficiently that it is destructive to any potential enemy, it will destroy you with the enemy. It's a two-edged sword without a handle, and if you grab it hard enough to wield it, you're going
It's
to...
just self-destructive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So cool to hear those words from Frank himself, because I don't know if you thought of this, Leo, but this could practically be lifted right out of Leto 2's journals in God Emperor of Dune, right? Like this
100%.
idea.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. The self-destructive weapon, the Western fallacy, this idea that we should always be inventing something new and using it. Leto is ranting about those things all the time. Those are big ideas that make their way in God Emperor of Dune. Here's Frank toying with them as early as 1969. It also, to me, explains why in the saga, the Ixians and Tleilaxu are sort of kept at arm's length. They're treated with distrust, and in the Tleilaxu's case, disgust.
Yeah.
In the novels, it's clear from this interview that Frank has a healthy skepticism of what he calls this quote-unquote Western scientific fallacy, which is the idea that all problems can and should be solved with science and technology. Frank is claiming that there are some problems that simply can't be solved with that approach.
Right. Yeah, and also this element of, you know, he says, I know we didn't pull the quote for this episode today, but he was talking about how society is moving in a direction where individuals are gaining more and more destructive power, and computers are only going to accelerate that trend.
Yes.
Because personal computers were an emergent thing at the time of a lot of these interviews. And in the 80s, Frank is like working on his own computer and making sure, like trying to like bring together this thing. It's really fun to hear him talking about basically what is Google Docs.
Yeah.
But
yes.
In like the 80s, he's like...
Right. In that Platt interview for that book that Chris Platt wrote.
Yeah.
He goes on this very long, weird tangent about this custom PC he's getting built that will allow him to search a document.
Yeah.
You know, like what you and I just think of as Command F is this mind-blowing thing to Frank. And he's getting a custom, like, high-end fucking rig built so that he can write on it using practically what is just like a word processor, Microsoft Word, Google Docs. But to him, that's a mind-blowing feat of technology to be able to do that.
Yeah, totally. And I think that is also an element here. It's like you might discover technology, you might discover tools and sciences, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should lean in fully without at least considering the implications.
Yes.
I'm sure Frank would have a lot of opinions about AI and how AI tools are being rolled out and pushed out just without, like, kind of with abandon. And it's maybe some caution would be good.
Yeah. Oh, he'd have fucking thoughts.
He'd have thought. He'd be like, new Leto 2 book. I know he's... We said spoilers for God Emperor of Dune. We know he dies at the end of God Emperor of Dune. New book! He came back, and he's talking about... He's, one more thing. More TED Talks.
Yeah. Right.
Well, his skepticism here also, and this is going back to these interviews, Frank's skepticism extends, of course, to governments and religious, organizations and bureaucratic institutions, and in general, these big themes that we've talked about at length. And going back to the Charles Platt interview from the 1980 book,
yes,
Frank says, quote, "I have a standard axiom. All governments lie. Don't believe anything they say. And corporations are only kinds of government." End quote.
Incredible.
Don't believe anything governments say is so fucking wild.
Wow.
Also, I really did he goes into this big rant about how big oil basically has America by the balls.
Yeah.
And how, he talks about there are organizations, companies that have more budget than France, the whole country. And how we don't think of companies as being countries, but in terms of purchasing power and their ability to do stuff and change the world, they are more significant than many world nations. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy that more people don't think in that terms.
So fascinating to hear his ideas here.
And I was reading that and I'm like, fuck yeah, preach, preach, Frank. Hell yeah, he's cooking with gas.
Hell
this is sick.
Frank, yeah, brother, let's go.
Pretty good. And a lot of corrupt politicians are lining their pockets in collaboration with these massive companies that basically just pay to have the policies passed that they need to. And that's just how it's been. And I don't think that's a crazy secret or a conspiracy theory.
No.
That's just how lobbying works in the U.S.
Yo, that's capitalism, baby.
That's capitalism. And, I think there's some conversations now about maybe the dangers of that, but we can also see Frank's own understanding of the situation evolve as well, because here's a quote from the 1985 speech. This is a few years later at UCLA, and you'll hear in this quote that he's a lot more direct about the political warnings in Dune and the kind of warnings about these things he's talking about.
Yeah. About our world to me. I wrote the Dune series because I had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on the forehead, may be dangerous to your health. I think the most dangerous president we've had, or one of the most dangerous at least, not because he was a bad guy, but because people didn't question him. One of the most dangerous presidents that we've had in this century was Jack Kennedy, because people said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Charismatic Leader, what'll we do next?" And we wound up in Vietnam. And I think probably the most valuable president of this century was Richard Nixon, because he taught us to distrust government. And he did it by example, which is the best kind of teaching. Well, anyway, I wanted to do this thing about...
Yeah.
Wow. Shouts to our guy Nixon.
Yeah, shouts to the best president ever, Richard Nixon. Right. Did no wrong, famously.
Who's your favorite president? Frank says, Nixon. Oh, incredible. It's a great point, right? And again, this could be words that Leto 2 speaks to Moneo in the book, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
To lead by example, Leto 2 is basically the most Nixonian figure in the fucking Dune saga. He's so horrible to all of humanity that he teaches a lesson buried deep in their bones that they will never forget. You can see where Frank got those ideas from in real-world politics and in his real-world distrust of institutions and bureaucracies and governments. It reinforces a lot of those ideas and themes in the book.
It really does.
And I know we're hammering this home, but to be explicitly clear about this, there is one more piece of tape we want to play for you. This is in 1983. It's a Walden Brooks interview he did alongside David Lynch, actually, to promote the film adaptation. And Frank lays it out beautifully. He lays out his political message in Dune very clearly here.
Pieces of wood at Golgotha. We fondly say that in the United States we separate church and state. That's an asinine statement. I am a political animal, and I've really never left journalism. I'm writing about the current scene. The metaphors are there. writing about the political ecology, the religious ecology, the social ecology, and the physical ecology of our world. And I think you do not separate any one part of this from the others. You don't separate mind and body and understand the human being.
There it is, folks. From Frank Herbert himself.
There it is.
There are deep political themes in Dune, many of which, again, that we have talked about, but is once again very reassuring and affirming to hear from the mouth of Frank Herbert himself. He very intentionally wrote these themes about ecology, about politics, into Dune, and the layers upon layers and layers of storytelling that are seeped within the writing, from chapter to chapter, paragraph to paragraph, book to book, all very intentional. Frank is being very explicit about the reasons he wrote these books.
Yeah. I mean, what really stood out to me as well is in the UCLA interview, right? He's talking to engineering students.
Yeah.
And he says why he is very impressed by and takes engineering very seriously is that their job as engineers is to affect the world around them. And so this is why he's talking to them, because he hopes to inspire them to affect the world.
Yeah.
So I see also as part of Frank's life this through line of he wants to make a change. He has opinions about what he thinks is right and wrong and where different things have gone astray. And then he is looking at what can I do? Where can I take the steering wheel in all of these different systems? And maybe it's just writing a series of books where I make all of this very clear. Maybe it's in movie deals. Maybe it's in X, Y, and Z. But it's clear that he was really trying to get something done. And maybe perhaps here I then have a new critique of Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, who've written these sort of like aimless, meandering sci-fi pop books that go back to the things that Dune was literally escaping and avoiding the sort of like social commentary that Dune is so clearly built on. If you're looking at Frank's words, how do you come away from this going, well, I guess I'll just write a book where, I don't know, there's a robot war?
Yeah. Right.
And it's like, okay, what's the message? How are you trying to help?
What's the message?
How are you trying to help society with this book? How are you trying to steer humanity through being a novelist? And it's like, well, there's like robots, they fight, and one of them's really mean. It's like,
exactly.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point, Leo. Frank, as he said in that clip, is writing about political ecology, religious ecology, social ecology, physical ecology. He's like writing about things with purpose, with a message. He's got ideas, he's got thoughts, he's getting them across in the book, and he's hoping to affect change.
Yeah.
So much of sci-fi, if you zoom out and just look at the genre of sci-fi, is to extrapolate on current ideas and to critique current things, whether it's humanity, religion, institutions, politics, and expand them into these futures that may or may not occur and toy around with what are the dangers. You know, a lot of sci-fi is dystopian for a reason, right? Because a lot of it serves as a warning of what could come if we continue down this path. If we continue down this ecological path, I don't get to tell my grandkids that they have a planet because we used it all up, as Frank said in that PBS interview. All of that is deeply ingrained in his Dune stories. And then you read a Brian book and you're like, what are you trying to say here, man?
Yeah.
Is there anything at all you're trying to say? And, you know, truthfully, the answer is no, because you're just trying to make money off of a franchise. And I think that's where the difference comes in. There's a purpose and an intention with Frank, and there's a respect for the medium of sci-fi. There's a really great quote about science fiction as a genre and science fiction stories as a medium for getting ideas across that Frank speaks about in that Vertex interview from 1973. Frank says, quote, "Now we are required in these generations to have a longer range view of what we inflict on the world around us. This is where I think science fiction is helping. I don't think that the mere writing of such a book as Brave New World or 1984 prevents those things which are portrayed in those books from happening. But I do think they alert us to that possibility and make that possibility less likely. They make us aware that we may be going in that direction." End quote.
Yeah.
Sci-fi, baby.
Sci-fi. It's the what if door that's open. Another thing he says, right? Like he's Sci-fi is great at asking those what ifs and exploring them. And if that means saying something like 1984, how does 1984 help people? Well, it helps them by answering the what if in a way that then alerts them to maybe the way that life actually is.
Yeah.
When you say the new Microsoft tool records everything you do on your screen all the time.
It's giving Big Brother.
It's serving Big Brother, Queen. It's skibbity constant observation. It's
Yeah. Many of the ways we tell these sci-fi stories can become the language we thus use, to reference these ideas,
Totally.
Big Brother is the surveillance state. Iconic cyberpunk stories introduce the idea of the metaverse, right? Like the sci-fi creates the language around big ideas that we can thus use in our real world. And I think Frank was very intentional with Dune in that way. And it's clear from these tapes that we've heard and the interviews and the magazines that we've read that he wanted to get his message across and make some sort of change in his world.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
It's admirable, for sure. And again, as much as it is a brand new thought, may actually be the most condemning thing we could say about Brian Herbert's works.
Yeah.
It's just that it's completely lacking those elements.
It lacks that conviction that Frank had.
Well, we're going to wrap up there. That's where we're going to end today's conversation.
Yes.
We've barely made a dent in our research. Listeners, I need to emphasize this to you. We are on page 11 of our script.
Of the script. Yep.
There are 26 pages of this script.
Of just notes.
Of
not
just
script,
notes.
Of notes.
That's true. There are probably 3 or 4 episodes worth of stuff in this.
Yeah. Yeah, there are entire interviews we've left out of today's episode that we haven't even referenced yet. There's so much more to dig into.
And for anybody who is familiar with, for instance, the UCLA interview, you will know there are things that we need to talk about in those interviews that we are not talking about today.
Yep.
We will talk about them.
Right.
We are going to continue digging through archives of tapes and transcripts. We're going to continue learning and kind of contextualizing for ourselves basically all we can that Frank has put out into the world when he was still with us.
Yeah.
So consider this episode just the first of a sort of multi-part meta-analysis of Frank and of his novels, of the Dune books.
Definitely.
And on that note, let us know if you like it.
We've never done anything like this, so
we are curious.
Yeah. Please let us know. I mean, this takes an incredible amount of research to put together an episode like this, but also it is incredibly rewarding to make these discoveries and to hear these ideas that you and I, Leo, have been spouting for hours on this podcast come out of Frank's own mouth in tapes from 40, 50, 60 years ago as Frank himself was toying with these ideas. It's very cool. And I, for one, feel very rewarded in learning more about an author that I greatly admire and a universe that means so much to me. But it is a lot of work. So please let us know if this is the type of episode you want to hear more in the future, and we'll continue to do so. If you hate it, though, then, our energy is better put somewhere else.
For sure. And just to reiterate this point, we really have only scratched the surface. If there's something you want us to talk about from these interviews, or maybe something that stuck out to you, let us know. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Frank's more esoteric philosophical ideas. Again, maybe even an observation of how his posture changed as a public figure and maybe how he stepped into maybe some of that performance a little bit.
Yeah.
His writing style, his thoughts on storytelling, his what sci-fi is at large. We kind of hinted at some of that today.
Right.
All of that and much more could be encapsulated in these episodes, these interviews with Frank Herbert episodes.
Yes.
Coming in the future months. So let us know.
That's right.
If you want to hear that.
That's right. And as always, at the end of the episode, before we let you go, dear listener, a couple of reminders on how to support this show and how to get in touch with us.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, the 2 best ways to support this show is to 1, become a patron, and 2, get yourself some Dune-themed swag from our merch store. Links to both of those will be in the show notes below, so please go check it out.
Indeed. And we love to hear from you. Today, more than ever, email us.
Yes.
gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com. We want to hear from you because, your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, your questions, that's what makes Gomjabar Gomjabar. Your cute pets is what makes Leo and Abu happy.
Truly.
But also these sorts of episodes, when we try something new, we really want to know what you think. So let us know. Email us, gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com.
That's right. One little anecdote we didn't mention about Chris Platt is that he went to go interview Frank at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
and was appalled by this idea. He even wrote that he likes to have breakfast leisurely at 11 a.m.?
Nuts.
I need Chris Platt to answer for his crimes, honestly. The audacity. This man was so flabbergasted that Frank would invite him to speak at 8 a.m. over breakfast.
I like that you've changed his name to Chris Platt because it's definitely Charles Platt. And Chris
Is it
Platt,
Charles?
Yeah, Chris Pratt is Mario, the Italian, Italian American actor.
I'm definitely mixing up the two in my mind.
And then he had the gall to be in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh my
God! Come on, Chris Platt.
How did he even get that physique? Huh? I don't believe it.
I don't believe it. Wake up at it. He's waking up at 11 and he looks that shredded. Come on, bullshit.
Well, friends, there is no real ending. It's just the place where you stop the recording. But this podcast is always one step beyond logic, so help spread the word of Muad'Dib and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And be sure to check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. We're also on TikTok at Gomjabar Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, whoever controls the podcast controls the universe. We'll see you on the Golden Path.